Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Thank you for joining us for this Business Over Breakfast webinar. We're being challenged by, in the words of Dr. David Thomas, President of Morehouse College, the intersection of two viruses, that of COVID-19 and that of social injustice, both at pandemic levels. These two viruses have created a tremendous set of challenges that impacts every aspect of our lives: our health, our wealth, our morals, our social and emotional well-being. As an educational institution, we have an obligation to help people learn and grow so that professionals and executives alike can meet these challenges and create a better future for everyone. One thing that is a common experience and challenge for many of us is the transition to remote work, which has had a very uncertain time horizon. Leading remote teams during these crises require huge adjustments that team leaders need to make to enhance virtual team effectiveness and performance. Today, our academic guide to help us with these challenges is Professor Peter Topping, Professor in the Practice of Organization and Management at Goizueta Business School. Peter's expertise spans leadership, organizational change, human capital, strategy and management, leading high-performance teams, cross-cultural leadership, negotiations, and conflict management. His courses include insights from working with organizational clients across industries, national boundaries, firm sizes, and sectors. As a consultant and executive coach, Peter understands the challenges facing today's leading executives and focuses on the very practical knowledge that takes leadership to the next level. So we are in excellent hands. Peter is going to kick off the webinar with his perspectives and then take questions along the way. So please write your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and our team will do their best to get as many of the questions answered as we can today. Also, if you find this session helpful, please consider continuing to learn with Peter in his August workshop, which is going to take a deeper dive into the challenges of leading remote teams during a crisis. So enjoy your coffee, enjoy your time with Peter this morning, because we're going to learn a tremendous amount. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Nicola, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating this morning. I think I have to change the slide because crisis is singular, and as Nicola so eloquently pointed out, it's plural. We have many challenges going on. And yet here we are trying to get work done, accomplished, and working with our teams to try to keep our level of performance. I got interested in this topic quite some time ago. Working with my executive MBA students, really more than 7 or 8 years ago, a number of them were involved in what we were calling at that point virtual teams, particularly global virtual teams. And they were struggling with the challenges of either by being a team leader or a team member on those kinds of team sessions. And I got interested in the topic because how can we help these folks? And we kind of all thought that virtual teaming was going to increase, not decrease. And certainly now we know remote teaming is the norm. So I began looking into the literature, as a good academic would do, about what was written about virtual teams. And there's very little that had been published at the time. In fact, still there's very little out there in the academic press. One article in particular, though, was very helpful. It was called Lessons from Sabre. And one of my former colleagues, Benson Rosen at the University of North Carolina, was a co-author. So I kind of knew that it was going to be a high quality paper. And there were some good suggestions there, some of which I'm built into the conversation today. But other than that, there really isn't a lot out there. So I started to collect kind of best practices from my students. And we talked about this in our course quite often. I also got involved in a program for the NCR Corporation that the state of Georgia was providing after they moved their headquarters from Ohio to Atlanta. And they were very involved in global virtual teams at the time because a lot of the growth of that business was happening outside of the US. So again, we talked about it, we shared best practices. I tried to keep an archive. So I've been collecting this information for a while. Recently, I started coaching a few folks who are working in 100% remote organizations. This, again, is all pre-pandemic. Vox Media, Zapier, and that company has gotten a lot of good press lately because obviously their folks have learned how to do remote teaming long before we all needed to do so. So I've tried to learn from them and also share some perspectives with them. So that's kind of my background in this topic. And I thought it was time for us to talk about this with as many people as we possibly could. And realize that what I'm trying to help is to look for practical tips. This is not an academic seminar or an approach. What can you do as a team leader or a team member or someone working with a team to help advance team effectiveness given the environment that we're in? So I have kind of 5 components to the talk today. One is to look at the transition to the remote work environment for the team. And then what are some of those leadership issues that are important? If you're a team leader, how do you have to rethink how you're leading your team in a remote environment? Then we get into some of the more specific tactics. Creating team focus and engagement is one of the big challenges. And then given our situation, how do we deal with the uncertainty, the anxiety, the stress that people feel, which comes out in their performance and their interactions among the team? And in every crisis, there is usually opportunity. So what can we learn from this experience? Because I don't think any of us expect the remote environment to go away post-pandemic. Once we get through this, if we're going back to work, there will still be remote workers, there will still be remote teams and virtual teams. So how can we use this time to get ourselves ready for that environment as well? In terms of process, I think Nicola covered it well. Each segment component will take about 5 to 10 minutes. I'll take periodic breaks to respond to a few questions as they come up rather than waiting for all of your questions at the end, because I would like to engage in some conversation with you. As she indicated, please submit your questions to the Q&A, and my team members will help monitor that for us. If you have questions at the end that do not get answered and you want to interact with me, I would welcome that. My email address is peter.topping@emory.edu. Please be patient though, if I get a lot of inquiries. It'll take me a while to go through them, but I will get back to you and would like to try to help all of us figure out how to do this better. And I hope you'll share your best practices with me as well. And then as Nicola mentioned, we're going to do a deeper dive into this because in 1 hour we can't cover this in the depth that I'd like to, but at least we'll tee up some of the issues. So getting started, one of the challenges for any leader in a crisis is what a colleague of mine, retired General Ken Keane, would call situational awareness. You really need to understand what's going on and look outside of yourself all around, both outside the organization, in the enterprise level, the division level, the unit level, the team level, and the individual level. And get your arms quickly around what the situation is and how it's impacting you and your team. One of the models that I think works in all situations, but particularly in crisis, is to use the lens of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you remember his pyramid, he talks about to get us up to the point where we're being our best selves, giving 100% of ourselves fully committed, growing and developing as individuals and leaders. We're up at the self-actualization part of the pyramid. However, according to Maslow, you're not going to get there if you can't successfully work your way up the more basic levels. And as you can imagine now, we're struggling at every level. You know, our basic needs physiologically are emotional, economic, physical safety is an issue now. Clearly, there are social demands that we're trying to face as we're working in isolation and self-quarantining. And then to feel a sense of achievement and recognition is much more difficult in this environment, getting up to the point where I can, again, be my best self. So that's one lens I encourage you to use as you try to kind of analyze and diagnose the situation you and your team are in. When it comes to that transition to remote work, this is my list. I put it together. Some of it's a little tongue-in-cheek. I encourage you to put your own list together of the positives and negatives of moving into the remote environment. And then perhaps have your team members do it as well and share those kind of differences and similarities with each other. So here are my positive aspects. I'm not commuting anymore, even though I'm in my office today. I haven't been here for 3.5 months. I came in to do the webinar. It's a little spooky around here, I might add, but it was a little easier commute than usual. However, I still don't like the commute, so not having to do it is found time and less stress on me. When I'm working from home, I feel at home. I'm comfortable in that environment, and I can work at my own pace. So if the dog needs a walk, or I've got the grandchildren visiting, I can work my way around those times and feel much more kind of at ease going in and out of work that way. I have more time with my wife, with my dog, May, and again, with the grandchildren who come to visit a couple times a week. And I don't have to make sure that I'm avoiding people I don't want to be around because I'm not around them. And saving a lot of money on dry cleaning bills as well. However, on the negative side, there's a definite loss of social interactions, and you feel it. And there's a fatigue, I think all of us feel, to being on a self-taught quarantine. There's no boundary between home office and work. While the commute is a pain, there's something good about that break where when you get home, you're home. But now our office is our home, and sometimes we're losing sight of the boundaries between the two. What I've heard from many people, including myself, is you have a tendency to work longer hours. And that's not helping our stress levels. Where time with family and pets can be a positive, in some instances, it might be a negative. Fortunately, not for me, but it can be for others where there's some difficulty in the family. And I think we're all experiencing Zoom fatigue. So we know, in fact, this being documented now with a fair amount of research. Your brain reacts differently to that environment, and we need to make sure we're taking good breaks. And while I like dressing casually, sometimes it gets a little bit too far. So again, I think you want to think about how would you create your list, positive and negative? And then what are your team members saying? Because this is part of situational awareness. But what we're here to talk about is the team transition. So here's my list from talking to people and my own experience. I am working with a team right now. It's a part of Emory, and we're doing some work on organizational culture. And while I'm not a full-time member of that group, I am facilitating that activity, trying to build the team. So these are the things we've been talking about as well. Here's what I think, and again, I encourage you to create your own list. Focusing the interactions become much more tactical. That's what I've heard over and over again. We work on projects, we try to get things done. We go through our checklist. That's our team interaction. What we're losing are the more informal, more kind of broad conversations that we would have had if we're in the office together. There's a greater need for effective information sharing, and I use the word effective strategically, because we can get too much information now that is not helpful. But if I'm working by myself at home and I'm trying to figure out how to make progress on our project, I need to know something from somebody else. I can't just run down the hall and ask them for it, or I can't dig in the archives physically. So I'm reliant on others to keep me informed. And because we're all working at home, we feel a sense of loss of knowing what's going on in the organization. And as we know, in the absence of real information, people make it up, and they tend to make it up negatively, particularly if they're under any duress. So heightened need for effective information sharing in a remote team environment. Then one of the things that's different from intact teams to remote teams is the importance of responsiveness. Of course, that's always an important quality, but it's more important in a remote environment. If I need information from you in order to make progress toward our project, and I send you an email and say, hey, can you share this with me? And I don't hear from you for 2 or 3 days. A lot of things are going through my mind, most of which probably aren't accurate, some of which might be, but they're not positive. I'm thinking, you don't care about me, you're trying to sabotage me, I'm not a priority for you, whatever that might be. I'm going through this because my trust is going down. This was one of the lessons from that research article I talked about, lessons from SABRE. The way you build trust on a remote team is through responsiveness. So if you send me an email and say, hey, I need this information, What I need to do is respond to you relatively quickly, within 12 to 24 hours, and say, got your email. I don't have that information readily available. I do know who to go to. I've reached out to them. It may take a few days, but I will get back to you. And if I don't hear from them in 2 days, at least I'll give you an update. So right there, I've acknowledged to you that I've heard you, I'm working on it, and I'll get back to you. That's how we build trust in a remote environment. And one thing I found with folks, and kind of knew this intuitively, is pre-existing team dysfunctions don't miraculously go away when you're working remotely. Many times they're exacerbated, but they do manifest differently. So you do want to keep your eyes open for how are the team dysfunctions getting in our way. So there are the main issues I think remote teams are having to address going to the remote environment. But I'd like to get a sense from you, which of those do you think is most important? So here, we're going to do a poll in a few seconds. I'd like you to select the one best response that is most relevant to your team environment right now, or your most recent team environment if you're not in one. Again, are we becoming much more tactically focused than before? Is information sharing much more critical to the team right now? Is responsiveness and lack of responsiveness having a greater impact? And do we see pre-existing team dysfunctions still exist, but maybe they come out in different ways? So Tiffany, can we release the poll now, please? Tiffany, I think we can close the poll. Thank you. There's a good distribution. Let's share the results with everybody. So you see that there's a good distribution. It's the heightened need for effective information sharing was number one. Again, becoming more tactical and those pre-existing issues. I'm glad to see the responsiveness was a little less, but I do think that's one of the things you want to keep your eye on in terms of how we get back to each other. And we'll talk a little more about that later. So thank you, Tiffany. If you can stop sharing those results, I'd appreciate it. Okay. So with that, what does that say to team leaders? Here are the thoughts I have about that. And as Nicola mentioned, I teach a lot of courses on leadership. That doesn't make me any more the expert on this than anybody else. I just have an opportunity to talk about it, think about it, read about it more. And I'm happy to share that with you, but I think you need to come up with your own list of best practices. I believe that in these times, one of the most important qualities of an effective leader, both in terms of working remotely and in a crisis, and you put the two together, they really magnify, is to elevate your emotional intelligence. So as you know, the main factors or qualities of emotional intelligence are one, self-awareness. So do you know how this is infecting you? Are you aware of your emotions? Do you know where they're coming from and why? Are you trying to deal with them as best you can? And do you try to manage those stress reactions so that your most productive behaviors come out of you and you manage the least productive behaviors and try to minimize the impact of your stress reactions, laying stress on others? Empathy is critically important here. And again, that's different from sympathy. Sympathy is important. Empathy, though, is understanding others from their point of view. How are they feeling? How are they reacting? What situation are they in order to know how to lead them more effectively? And then social skills is how well you connect with a wide range of people based on your self-awareness, your self-regulation, and your empathy. So those are the kinds of things that I think are important for leaders in a remote crisis, team environment during a crisis. We don't see any one right way to lead, by the way, and we teach this in all of our leadership courses. Emotional intelligence is one framework. There are many. And if another one works for you, go with it. I do think one of the keys here, though, is to learn how to adapt your leadership practices based on the needs of your followers in the situation that you're in, while being true to yourself. So those are the three legs of the stool. And an effective leader is one who can adapt to the situation, change their practices and style, but still be authentic, still be their true selves. That's an art, and it's not always easy. So the remote environment requires adaptation. And we need to understand that situation, as I talked about at the very beginning. We need to understand our followers, the empathy piece, and where they're coming from. And then we need that self-awareness to know where we're coming from. As a leader in this combination of issues, people acumen and empathy are even more important than before. Sure, your business acumen, your technical acumen are important, but frankly, folks, I believe at least less so. You have team members who can bring their technical and business acumen to the table. You need to focus on people acumen, helping them, understanding them, getting them more focused and engaged, getting the best from your team. To me, that's always the manager's challenge anyway. But in particular, I think that's an issue for us today. And to do that, you need to be a good listener. I was taught by a mentor to listen with 3 ears. And if any of my former students are involved in this presentation today, I think you remember this. And I know we're only born with 2, but there's a 3rd ear that's at least an inner ear. So what am I talking about? Your first ear is listening for what the person is saying. Your second ear is listening for what you think that person wants to say, but isn't saying. And your third ear is listening for what the person isn't saying, what they're not talking about. And second and third ears are different. So think about it. If I'm listening to what you're saying, I have to pay attention. And in a remote environment, that's harder. There are distractions. You've got family members, pets, you got emails coming in. You could easily turn off your webcam and start multitasking. You're not really listening. You think you are, but you're not. And then listening to what they want to say, but they're not saying. How do you know someone has something on their mind, but it's not coming out? And in a remote environment, that's even more difficult because you don't see the body language. So you got to look for cues. For example, they start a sentence and stop. You say, hey team, how's it going? And there's a long pause and someone says, we're doing all right. I'm okay. Well, there's probably more to the story there. You may not be able to press that right away, but that's something you want to pay attention to and come back to later. And then the issue of what they're not talking about. Well, what they're not talking about are things that you know they should be talking about. It's what the elephant in the room phenomenon. And I know we all know that. And what the folks in psychiatry here would say, I have an appointment in the School of Medicine to work with that department and bring this business school and the School of Medicine a little closer together. And what I've learned from them is that when the patient comes to see you as a therapist, especially in the beginning, they may talk about their mother, they'll talk about their siblings, but if they haven't talked about their father for the first couple of 3 sessions, that's the topic you really want to dive into. Because the issue that raises the most conflict is the one we most try to avoid. So when people aren't talking about a topic that you know needs to be talked about, you need to pay attention and figure out, how do I bring that in? So think about it. If you're listening for what they're saying in a remote environment through Zoom conversations or on the phone or even through email, if you're listening for what they want to say but they're not saying, and then for what they're not talking about, you're doing some very good listening. And in these days, that's important. Now, working on your listening skills will always be important. This is a good thing to do anyway, so this is a good time to work on it. And then finally, one of the issues that a good leader, especially one with emotional intelligence, needs to do in these times is to demonstrate resilience, to be able to bounce back from a difficult situation. And we have to acknowledge the realities of that situation. You can't pretend it doesn't exist. So let's talk about what's going on among all the things in our society today. And then it's okay to share your personal struggles and vulnerability with it, to acknowledge that you're feeling your own stressors and your own anxiety about the uncertainty. However, the leader needs to show a sense of optimism, not naive, not unrealistic, but there is an end to this. We will get through this together, and maybe we'll learn something from it along the way. So you need to be the role model for others. And that means you need to take care of yourself in order to help them take care of themselves. So again, for a leader, emotional intelligence is important. Learning to adapt your practices based on the difference of the situation here, and being able to employ those tactics and how you interact with your folks, demonstrating resilience, etc., are some of the keys to this. But let's stop here for a moment. And Keisha, let me see if there are any questions that we have from any of the participants. I'll give them a minute or two to relay those questions. And then
we do, Peter. We actually do. This is great. One of the first questions asks, how do you see changes in our ability to develop strategic thinking in this more tactically oriented environment?
That's an important question. And some of the folks that I'm doing some coaching with, we've spent a lot of time talking about that. So I'll give you my perspective and share with you what they reacted in terms of our conversations. Of course, every situation is a little bit different, so we do want to think about that. You have to be purposeful in doing it. It won't just happen. And that means as a leader, you need to try to step out of the situation and get your team to have a couple of sessions where we're thinking about post-pandemic, post-crisis. What are the things, how is our business changing, and what does this mean for us? If you're not a strategic thinker yourself, you can still do this by engaging the strategic thinking of your team. And one of the challenges to any leader is to identify their own successor, or the people who are got the bandwidth to be a high potential to be promoted. And so one of the things you want to do is watch and observe the strategic thinking of your team members, because those are folks that could have some real potential to move up the organization eventually. It's a development opportunity. So I do think you want to structure time to talk about it. You can share information, articles, case studies, items we've read in the paper, things that are coming out from your executive team, but you do have to work at it. So that's my best suggestion, is don't think it's going to happen by itself. Keisha, do we have another question?
We do. Thank you, Peter. Are there any strategies to maintain focus and stay motivated on work when so much is going on externally?
I love that question, because that's our next piece. So let's talk about that right now. And if we didn't get to your question, we'll come back to as many as we possibly can. So this is, I think, what most people are struggling with. And I want to try to be as tactical as I can be, realizing that I don't know your situations in great detail, but give you some things to think about. And this is a comment that I think is important for leaders in any situation. What you do is important. How you do it at times can be more important. And particularly in this situation, the how is something you definitely want to think about, not just what we're doing. So how you get people engaged and how you help them create focus. So we're going to do another poll. Tiffany's going to tee this up for us in a minute, but let's go through it quickly, because I want to get a sense of what you think are the real challenges to focus and engagement. This will be our last poll, I promise. And here you can select as many of the options that are relevant to your team right now. So are we struggling with not knowing what the expectations are? Are you no longer sure of your role on the team, or is that something other team members are expressing? The feeling of isolation, not feeling a part of the team. Are we becoming more inefficient in how we get work done because we're not sitting next to each other? Or are we becoming less effective in getting work done because of all the other distractions going on in our lives? Are we having too many Zoom meetings that are unproductive and really causing us distress? And are some team members much less engaged than others? So Tiffany, can we launch the poll, please? Let's see what you are experiencing. Again, check as many as are relevant. Thank you. It's good responses. I know some of you are still entering them, but I think for time's sake, Tiffany, can you share the results right now? All right, let's take a look, folks. So all of them seem to be relevant. No longer sure of my role is the least problematic right now for this group. The loss of effectiveness, that's good. Those are two important elements. Lack of engagement from some team members, though, is highest. And certainly the feelings of isolation are important, and loss of efficiency, loss of clarity of expectations. Thank you. So let's start talking about some of those. And again, each team's going to have its own. So I'm encouraging you again to do this kind of conversation with your team. But here are the things that I have found helpful in the work I've learned from others and my own work and the folks that I'm kind of coaching today. I have a model I like to use. Some of you might recognize it. It's pretty simple. It's a mnemonic device. It's easy for this old boy to remember. And it's called helping the team get a grip. The G stands for goals, R for roles, I for interpersonal relationships, interactions, and the P for process. My point here is that while grip is important for any team at any time, it might be different for your team now in a remote environment. So it would be worth going through it again. I realize that for most of us, including myself, we've been at this for 3 months. And so it's not like it's just started this week. What a great time to take a process check, though, and start and go back and say, okay, folks, what have we learned from this? Where are we? And how do we need to improve? The most important thing you can do in leading a remote team is help them become good learners. The team members, the team as a whole, and you as a team leader. Because again, we're going to need to be better at this as time goes on. And each day gives us a chance to practice and get better, if it's good practice. So goals. This is where the short-term focus comes in. One thing we're hearing from folks is that the best way for me to stay focused is to keep it narrowly focused. Next couple of weeks, what do we need to get done? Let's be clear about it. Let's be sure about it. Let's see if there are any challenges to it that any of us have, and then let's go get it. And that doesn't mean we lose sight of the whole and the bigger picture, but narrow the focus in terms of duration from months to weeks and be able to get through that and see how you've accomplished it. If we haven't accomplished our goals, then how do we adjust to it? But if we have, let's celebrate that and go on to the next one. The roles issue, while it may not have come out high in the polls, I know it has in some other organizations. So let me just mention it. How might there be different roles we need people to play in a remote environment that we wouldn't need to play when we're all together? For example, do we need someone to be more of a facilitator in Zoom conversations? Do we need someone to be that information hub? We talked about the importance of effective information sharing. So I think it would be helpful just to review the roles that are currently being played. And do we need to adapt any of those? And is there any lack of role clarity that any of the team members are experiencing? Because that's a real stopper of performance and engagement. Interpersonally, the question is, all right, what are our new norms for how we work in a remote environment? What's different about our interactions? And again, the one example I've given you already is responsiveness. Let's set a norm for how quickly we get back to each other when an inquiry comes in from a team member. We move them up the priority list. We might say, we'll get back within 12 hours, within 24 hours, whatever it is, set the norm and live with it. And then, of course, other things such as participation, being on the call, keeping the camera on, etc. Those are things about how we get along in a remote environment. Just want to clarify and make sure we're all in agreement. And then team process. This was the biggest learning for me in looking at virtual teams 7 or 8 years ago. Virtual teams need more process, more structure than intact teams. And if we haven't adapted our processes and structures, then we're not as efficient. And that was one of the issues that came out in the poll, that while we may be effective, we're less efficient, which means we're spinning our wheels more, we're having to work harder, longer, in order to get the same things done. So how do we realign and reassess our processes to make things more effective for the team? Now, from a leader's perspective, one way you have a responsibility for the engagement and focus is that in a counterintuitive sense, you need to spend more time interacting one-on-one with your team members than you would have in the office. Because if you're all together, they kind of see you, you see them. Even if you're not talking to them, there is some connection. But in the remote environment, there isn't. And if I'm feeling isolated and not a part of the team, if I'm going through some difficult times myself, either personally or even with work, that is affecting my performance. I'm disengaging. So that's where I think the team leader needs to spend more time reaching out to team members one-on-one. And while we're all having some Zoom fatigue, phone conversations are becoming more accepted and more appreciated. And of course, you can always do email, but I think at least having that live communication can be very important. So if I give you a call and just check in, how is it going? And we'll talk a little bit about work, but I'd rather talk about you and how you're doing. And then I'm listening with 3 ears, trying to get a sense, because I have a feeling something's going on, but I'm not sure what it is. I can't see you. So I need to try to reach out to you and give you the opportunity to reach back to me when something comes up. So spend more time interacting with your team members individually. Some other kind of specific tactics for engagement that others have found helpful and I support as well in general is we do problem solving differently. One of the opportunities here is we have a chance to empower our team members. When we're working in an office environment, your team might come up with suggestions to you about a decision that has to be made, and you might run it up to your boss. And those conversations might happen rather sporadically or kind of ad hoc basis. Harder to do remotely. And so really, in order to get work done, we need to push decision-making down. And that means we have to have confidence in our teams to make those decisions. Most team members want to feel empowered, want to feel that they have a greater impact. Now is an opportunity for you to do so. And since we're getting a little tired of all team meetings, this is a great chance for you to do some collaborative team meetings. And so you create sub-teams. So let's say you have 5, 6, 7 people on your team. Put 2 people on a particular subtask or part of the project and have them interact together and give them specific issues to look at and come back with recommendations about how to resolve. Teach them how to do that so that they don't come to you and say, hey, what do you want us to do? They come to you and say, hey, we've looked into it. Here's the information we have. We've talked to 4 or 5 other people that we thought should be a part of this conversation. Here are the options. And we think this is our best strategy going forward or our best approach going forward. That's teaching them something and empowering them. So you want to, as a leader, delegate decision-making whenever and wherever appropriate. But you do have to monitor, guide, and coach those sub-teams. So creating collaborative activities among your team or engaging team members on your group with a team member from another unit. That's one way to keep people engaged and give them a chance to really dig in. And then we need to co-create mechanisms to measure team performance. How do you know how your team is doing? My students know I use this expression. It's my language. You might have other words to use. But teams like to know the score. So we want to keep score for our team. Companies keep results. They look at, did you in fact hit your numbers? Did you achieve the objectives? That's important, clearly. But that's done at the end, looking backwards. The team wants to know how they're doing as they're playing so that they hit the results they need to hit and make mid-course corrections. I encourage you to have your team create its own scorecard. How do we know how we're doing as a team? Well, what are some of the criteria? For example, timeliness of responsiveness, good information sharing, good conflict management, high levels of engagement participation, equity in terms of workload. Have them create their own scorecard. And then periodically take a pulse check, have them fill out the scorecard. Initially, you may need to do it anonymously if they don't feel comfortable saying it directly to each other, but eventually you'll get to the point where they can, which I think would be very helpful. But if they create the scorecard, they're more likely to live up to those specific criteria. And you keep track of those scores to see if you're making progress. So taking those periodic process checks is very important. And as I mentioned before, learning is a key. So how do you build in learning in a remote team? Here at Goizueta, we use the after-action review process that General Keene, our Associate Dean for Leadership Development, has helped teach us. So after an activity, we go through what did we do? How did we plan? How did we execute? What were the results? What were the things we did well? What were the things we need to improve? And then how do we make sure that we do those things to improve the next time? So we're building a learning organization. I think those are things that are extremely important to do. Going a little bit further on specific tactics, I encourage people to have fewer but more productive all-team meetings. That's the one thing that's the gripe you hear from more and more people. We're having too many Zoom meetings and it's driving me crazy. So a good meeting planner does this anyway, but you really need to do it in this environment. Have a focused agenda, keep the topics down to a minimum, 2, 3, 4, no more than that. Distribute the agenda in advance, give people a chance to think about it, react to it, comment, and maybe revise it. One thing your team members want to know is what's going on in the company, what's going on around us. We're not around it anymore, we don't know. So they always want to hear updates, anything you've learned that would be helpful for them to know, just to keep them connected to the company. And if you don't know something, admit it and say, I will dig into it and find out. So ask them what they want to know and see if you can figure it out. However, you don't want to go around the team and say, all right, give us an update on what you're doing. Nothing can be more boring than that. Do that in advance, do that electronically. Don't have this as a, everybody give us an update conversation. Rather, have dialogue, have conversations. Use the Zoom meetings to actually converse. It's not that hard to do. I was taught by Peter Senge, who was a professor at MIT, about the distinction between dialogue and discussions. And I like to use this for myself in differentiating between dialogue that is informing and conversational, and discussions which are persuasion. Because the word discussion has the same roots as the words concussion and percussion. So if you think about it, in a discussion, I'm whacking you over the head with my ideas and you're whacking me over the head with yours. We're not listening. We're trying to persuade you that I'm right and you're trying to persuade me that you're right. Dialogue, the roots of that word in Latin are through conversation. So we make progress when I inform you how I see it, but I want to know how you see it. And maybe collectively, we both see it differently. So in a Zoom meeting, I encourage you to have more dialogues, fewer discussions. Use the opportunity to advance how we all think about issues. And then, of course, as part of that eye of the grip model, establish your Zoom norms. You know, classic things, we've all talked about this, webcams on, audio muted. Maybe you have different team members lead different parts of the agenda. So you have 3 agenda items, you have 3 different people leading the conversation on each of those. That gets them engaged. Use the interactive tools. I had to kind of transition 5 courses I was teaching in the spring semester from live classroom to online. And we had 2 weeks to get that done. One thing a lot of us learned, and our faculty here are pretty committed to doing this the best way we possibly can, is use the breakout rooms. So if you have 7 members on your team, create breakout rooms and put 2 or 3 people in a breakout room, have them talk and come back. Do the polls as we just did here, so people can kind of express themselves anonymously and you get a sense of the kind of the team and the range of perspectives. And then the chat function can be most useful in a Zoom meeting, because if we're all meeting together in a room, usually 2 or 3 people dominate the conversation, and there are a couple of folks who are always quiet. They have some very interesting perspectives that you want to hear, but it just doesn't come out in the room. Well, in a Zoom meeting, it can come out. You can pose a kind of a interesting question, one that doesn't have a rhetorical answer, and ask each person to respond to it in chat form. And they have to, input their response before they see everybody else's response. And then you can see how everybody's thinking about this and maybe pick on 1 or 2 of the responses that are different and use that as a springboard, again, for the dialogue, for the conversation. So the chat function, it can be a way to engage people in a meeting that normally would be drowned out by the extroverts in the room. And then, of course, as we've all learned, try to schedule some virtual times, Zoom times, that are not business. Coffee breaks. That was one of the suggestions, best practices from one of the NCR executives, who said that for her global virtual team, they created a virtual coffee break. Again, this goes back about 10 years. And it was a certain time of day that wasn't painful to people in different time zones around the world. So everybody could kind of get on. And the one thing that was the taboo, no talk of business. Now, she thought that the first time they did this, people would kind of sign in and see out of curiosity what would happen. But she expected that it wouldn't have much momentum going forward. And to her pleasant surprise, it gained momentum. They really enjoyed that. Now that requires a kind of a mature team, but there are other ways to do this where you get people together on Zoom and you're not talking business. From my Zoom sessions with my faculty colleagues here, I've learned more about them virtually than I would have learned in person. And I think that's one of the benefits of this environment. Now, let's get to one more important topic before we close.
I'm sorry, Peter, can we interrupt you for just a moment? We seem
Sure.
to be having some wonky technology issues going on with the Zoom, and we're wondering if you could restart your slides, restart your screen share and see if that will address the issue. We're seeing your slides as panelists, but unfortunately the participants are not seeing your slides.
Okay, so I just unshared. And should we try again?
Perfect. Let's try again.
I have. Is that any better?
I can see your screen, but we're wondering if the participants are able to see.
Okay. You can see my screen now?
Yes, we're getting feedback that you can see. We're not sure what happened.
Okay.
But thank you.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for interrupting. Let me go backwards then. I think I covered these, but just to have you see it. Again, fewer, more productive meetings and establishing your Zoom norms, I think, are important things. Let's go back one more. Empower your team members to problem solve and to come up with a team scorecard that you can measure team performance and effectiveness while you're working, taking process checks. So now getting to this question of how do I deal with the uncertainties and the anxieties that we're all feeling. There's good stress. Stress that I feel doing this webinar, having to be on camera and hopefully be productive and effective. And so it does affect your adrenaline, etc. And the good part about it is that hopefully it helps me perform well. And I have a recovery time. So when this is all over, I'm going to be quiet. I'll be able to recover, learn from this, and go on. That's good stress. Toxic stress is there's no end in sight. It's ongoing. And you really don't have a chance to recover. And that's the stress we're all feeling. When will the pandemic end? When will the issues around social injustice end? And all the other factors involved. So we know everybody's stress level is high. When your stress level is high, a lot of bad things happen. One, it's just bad for your health, your physical health, your mental health, but it also is bad for your behavior and how you interact with your team members. More irritable, more short-tempered, things come out that might not have come out. So one of the things a team leader and team members need to do is how do we reduce stress for myself and for everyone? So one, be aware of your stress levels. That's the self-awareness part. Two, try to role model effective stress management. Whether you're a team member or a team leader, you can do that for others. Be attentive to the signs of people who are getting overstressed. They're not necessarily going to tell you. And in a remote environment, you don't see it the same way. But the clues are there. Look for them. Look for them in the email stream. Look for them in when they're responding to things. Look for that in how they're responding to things. And then talk about it on the team. What's our stress levels? Take a poll on it. I do this with my students. And then we talk about what are some of the best practices people are using right now to reduce their stress. How do we do that collectively? And then help people turn off work. Give them a chance to stop. So if you're emailing folks at 1, 2, 3 in the morning, you're not role modeling good behavior. If you have something you want to email to them and you're up at that time, which I hope you're not, but if you are, write the email, but don't hit send. Save it. Send it when the workday begins. Try to set boundaries. And then be flexible in how they get work done. They may have kids at home or other issues that they're dealing with. It doesn't necessarily matter in terms of that and how they get it done, as long as they do get it done. And then let's focus on everybody becoming more resilient. Now, how do you do that? I've been digging into this, and fortunately we have some experts in Emory Healthcare on resilience who have shared their insights with my students and myself. And it's very helpful. And one of the most important lessons I've learned is it's not extraordinary. The human being is designed to be resilient. Now, some of us are more resilient than others, and we all can develop greater levels of resilience. So how do we bounce back from a difficult situation? And how do we use that for personal growth and development? That's, I think, the goal. How can we learn from this and be better? Now, here are some of the kind of tools in the psychological toolbox. Obviously, a positive outlook, being an optimist, helps. However, you don't say to someone who's a natural born pessimist, hey, you need to change your mindset, be more optimistic. That doesn't work. I can't just change my brain. And pointing that out, by the way, can make me feel bad about myself. So you got to go about that differently. I would acknowledge their feelings. Yes, I can see that those are some things that could happen, and they're a concern to us all. But can we look at it differently and see other ways this might come out that wouldn't be quite so bad? I want to help you look at it differently. I can't tell you to do it, and just drink a glass of water, you'll be fine, is not an effective tactic. Strong social connections are a part of our resilience. And right now, that's obviously a challenge. So how do we do that? And how do we help our team members stay connected to their families and their friends? So you have to go out of your way to make those social connections work in a remote environment. Then the ability to feel and express gratitude. We're all struggling, but I'm grateful that I have a job, that my family's healthy, that my grandchildren can visit me. These are things I feel very fortunate to have. And there are a lot of folks who are in a lot worse shape. So let's think about the things we should be grateful for. That helps develop our resilience. And then one of the things that was a profound lesson for me is helping others helps us be more resilient, gives us more meaning and purpose. So if I've got a team member who's struggling, helping that person helps me. There's a debate in the psychiatric community, is there any such thing as altruism? Can anybody be really in it completely for somebody else, not for themselves? I don't think it matters. Helping somebody else can help you. So fine, help them and help yourself as well. So reaching down to folks who need help, whether it's on your team, in your organization, or elsewhere. All right, Akeisha, can we stop right here and see if there are any questions before we close?
Absolutely, Peter. There was a request to go back to review the grip slide that you had up earlier. And then there's a question on any suggestions on how to address consistent lack of follow-up and responsiveness with team members.
Yeah, you have to hold them accountable. And while we give allowance for what's going on in the environment, you also have to make sure things do get accomplished. So we have to individualize it a bit, because that person may be going through things that you're not aware of. So that's the listening with the 3 ears part, and having that personal relationship. And making sure that they find a way to get things done. And if they can't, maybe it's time for them to take a personal leave. Maybe something's going on where they need to step out for a while. Maybe reassigning them to a different role. But to just let it slide and say, well, okay, I understand you're struggling, and I'll do this for you. That is not a good answer. So unless you absolutely have to, try not to reduce all accountability for their performance, or they'll never get better. Another question, Keisha?
Peter, could you share some tools, material, readings on effective listening?
Boy, that's a good one. I wish there was a simple set there. McKinsey had an article a couple of years ago called Effective Listening for Executives. And I think it works for anybody. But what I'll do is, if you want to kind of read an article or two on listening, send me an email and I'll send you a reference that I can find for you. But if you Google it, you'll find it as well. So there are a number of approaches to effective listening. I think it's probably the most important leadership skill any of us can have right now, especially in a remote environment. Let me move on, and then we'll see if we have time for a few more questions. Because during a crisis, there are often opportunities. So for example, the question before about being strategic, now's a good time to talk about what's the, and I don't like new normal, I'm going to use the term that I've heard, next normal. What are we going to be coming out of, and how can we make progress now? So good thing to start talking about. One of the things that you can do is improve your team culture. So working in the remote environment, how do we get better at this, will help us build the kind of culture we want to have post-pandemic. Again, empowering people, effective delegation, getting collaboration going, those are all things you want to see happen later. So let's start working on them now. I'm finding team chemistry and cohesiveness can get stronger in a remote team. It's counterintuitive, and yet it does and can happen. We get to know each other differently than we did before. And one of the key ingredients here is what's been talked about pre-pandemic. Research by Google has made this more popular. It's the concept of psychological safety. Harvard professor Amy Edmondson has done some good writing, and a couple of talks about this you can find through YouTube. This is not a new concept. Psychological safety has been around a long time, but it is extremely important now, and you can make progress at it. In its essence, I'm going to be a little superficial in my definition for time's sake. Psychological safety is you being allowed to be you. Not wearing a mask, not trying to pretend, not feeling I can't be myself. This is the inclusivity part that's so important today. To be your full, true self. To speak candidly, respectfully, but candidly, to let us know what you're really thinking and feeling. That brings out your best. This is an opportunity to work on that. So, have situational awareness. Think about this for yourself, but also ask the team, what's different? What do we need to deal with? What's changed about our situation? And then adapt your leadership practices based on that. And your primary role, in my opinion, is to help your team stay focused and engaged, the two most important things, which requires a lot of people acumen. How do we de-stress or at least reduce stress? We can't make it go away, but how do we deal with it more effectively as a team? And then how do we use this time to get better, to get smarter? And I hope this stuff has been helpful for you. Keisha and Christine, a couple more minutes and then we'll have to close. Any more questions?
Thank you so much, Peter. Great information. We do have a couple of more questions in. One of them asks, essentially, how do you best maintain a different but equal environment to keep resentments and stress to a minimum within the team?
One is you work on yourself first. The best way to lead others is to lead yourself first. Resentment is usually a sign of conflict, which is typically a sign of inner conflict, which is, again, something that most of us don't really think about. In that if I'm angry with you or resentful toward you, that's what's coming out. The high likelihood is the conflict is inside me. There's something going on in me that is coming out in a way that I'm resentful toward you. Now, you're not a therapist, and I'm not encouraging you to become one, but to realize that when that is coming out of people, that is a sign that they're in distress. So that's where you want to step in individually and get to that person and start trying to dig and see what's really going on, and then help them with their behavior. That expressing that to others is not helping the team, it's not helping their reputation, it's not accomplishing what they hope to accomplish. We've got to find another way. So this is the people acumen part that's really difficult. Resentment coming out of others is a sign of that person's inner conflict usually.
Thank you, Peter. I think we have time for one more question. How do you change the team's attitude if upper management doesn't have the right approach to internal issues?
That's always a challenge, particularly in a remote environment. It's more of a challenge. What you don't want to do is get the team to start collectively deciding upper management doesn't know what the heck they're doing. We need to have empathy for them as well. In these times, everybody's struggling. One thing you want to do, though, is try to circulate better ideas up in a respectful way. Now that is different in each situation, so it has to be thoughtful. But how does the team push up ways and kind of messages about how we can do things better in a way that would get senior management to listen? You have a stronger voice collectively than you have individually. Maybe getting another team or two on board and pushing that message up could make a difference. I think right now, once we get past their defense mechanisms, upper management is looking for solutions. You can offer some. And I think we've run out of time. Again, thanks so much for being a part of this. Hope it was helpful.
Thank you so much, Peter. And we want to thank you all, our attendees, for joining us each and every Thursday morning for the Business Over Breakfast webinar series. Just a couple of notes before we close out this morning. A copy of this recording will be available on the Emory Executive Education LinkedIn page. That recording will also include a viewing of the slides that Peter shared with us today. As Nicola mentioned earlier this morning during the welcoming, Peter is going to go into a deeper dive of this topic with a quick workshop on leading remote teams during a crisis in August. Additional information and the link to find the information is located in your chat box there. Next month, we are going to be continuing with the Business Over Breakfast webinar series with the return of Tom Smith and Patrick Noonan on July 2nd and July 9th. And in just a couple of moments, you will notice a brief survey pop up on your screen. We want to ask you to give us some feedback on today's session. Again, we thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all next Thursday at 9 a.m. Have a wonderful day.